Your father wanted his real family to be taken care of, my stepmother Victoria announced, standing at the head of the mahogany conference table in the law firm where my father's will was being read. Her perfectly manicured hand rested possessively on the leather portfolio containing the document that would supposedly erase me from my father's legacy. Everything goes to me and my sons. You were always just a complication from his first marriage. The words hung in the air of that sterile conference room, witnessed by two lawyers, my two stepbrothers who couldn't quite hide their satisfaction, and me, Alexandra Morrison, the daughter who'd been systematically erased from her own father's life over 15 years of calculated manipulation. I sat perfectly still in my tailored black suit, my hands folded calmly in my lap, and watched my stepmother deliver what she thought was the killing blow. Around the table, everyone waited for my reaction, the tears, the protests, the emotional breakdown that would confirm their narrative of me as the bitter, jealous daughter who couldn't accept her father's new family. Instead, I smiled. I understand, I said, my voice steady and professional. Thank you for making this so clear. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, confused by my composure. She'd expected devastation, not acceptance. She'd prepared for battle and instead found surrender. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been preparing for this moment for 3 years. Ever since I'd discovered the depth of her deception, the systematic poisoning of my relationship with my father, and the elaborate scheme to steal everything he'd built. What they especially didn't know was that I was a lawyer specializing in estate planning and fraud litigation. And the will my stepmother was about to rely on was a masterpiece of legal manipulation that would destroy her in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. Before we witness how a daughter reclaimed her father's legacy and brought down the family that tried to erase her, I want to thank each of you for being part of our community of over 300,000 subscribers who believe that justice delayed is not justice denied. If you've ever been excluded from your own family, overlooked in favor of those who manipulated their way into positions of power, or written off as irrelevant by people who underestimated your intelligence and determination, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button to join thousands who appreciate stories of strategic revenge and long-term planning that prove the best victories aren't won through emotion, but through patience, intelligence, and absolute certainty. Now let's step into the world of high-stakes estate litigation and family betrayal that would ultimately cost my stepmother everything she'd stolen. My name is Alexandra Catherine Morrison, and 20 years ago I was Daddy's little girl. My father, James Morrison, built Morrison Commercial Real Estate from nothing into a $200 million empire of office buildings, shopping centers, and luxury residential developments across the Southeast. He was a self-made man who'd started as a construction worker, put himself through night school, and climbed his way to the top of Atlanta's competitive real estate market through sheer determination and brilliant strategic thinking. My mother, Catherine, died of cancer when I was 12 years old. I remember my father holding my hand at her funeral, tears streaming down his face as he promised that nothing would ever come between us, that we would face the world together as a team, that her memory would always be the foundation of our family. For 3 years, it was just the two of us in our Buckhead mansion, navigating grief together while my father threw himself into work and I threw myself into academics. He attended every school play, every debate competition, every award ceremony. We had Sunday dinners where he'd ask about my dreams and ambitions, encouraging me to pursue law school and join the family business as general counsel when I graduated. Then he met Victoria Blackwell at a charity gala. She was 15 years younger than my father. blonde and beautiful in that calculated way of women who've perfected the art of appearing effortlessly elegant. She was recently divorced with 2 teenage sons, and she approached my father with the perfect combination of vulnerability and admiration that wealthy, lonely men find irresistible. The courtship was swift. Within 6 months they were engaged, and my father sat me down for what he called an important conversation about our expanding family. "Alexandra, sweetheart, I know this is fast," he said, holding both my hands across the kitchen table where we'd shared countless meals and conversations. "But Victoria makes me happy in a way I haven't been since your mother died. And I think you'll love having brothers. This house has been too quiet for too long." I was 15 years old, still grieving my mother, and desperately wanting my father to be happy again. So I smiled and said I was thrilled, even as something deep in my gut warned me that Victoria's interest in my father had more to do with his bank account than his heart. The wedding was lavish, held at the Atlanta Botanical Garden with 300 guests and coverage in the society pages. Victoria wore a custom Vera Wang gown that cost more than most people's cars. And her sons, Brandon and Trevor, aged 17 and 15, stood beside their mother looking smug and entitled in their expensive suits. I was the maid of honor, standing on my father's side, watching my family transform into something I no longer recognized. The changes began subtly, like drops of poison administered so gradually that you don't realize you're dying until it's too late. Victoria redecorated our home, erasing my mother's elegant, understated style and replacing it with ostentatious luxury that screamed new money. Family photos that had included my mother disappeared, replaced by professional portraits of Victoria and her sons. "We need to focus on the future, not dwell in the past," Victoria explained when I asked about my mother's pictures. "It's not healthy for your father to be constantly reminded of his loss." My mother's beloved garden was torn up and replaced with a swimming pool and pool house. Her personal items, jewelry, clothing, books, were donated to charity without consulting me. Her presence was systematically erased from the home she'd created, as if she'd never existed at all. But the real manipulation was far more insidious than interior decorating. Victoria began positioning herself as the gatekeeper to my father's attention and affection. Business dinners that I'd always attended suddenly became adult conversations that would bore a teenager. Father-daughter traditions like our Sunday dinners were gradually replaced with family activities that always seemed to highlight Brandon and Trevor's interests rather than mine. "Your father is so busy with the business," Victoria would say with false sympathy. "He asked me to take you shopping instead. Here's his credit card." She was buying my compliance with money while stealing something far more valuable, my relationship with my father. When I tried to talk to my father about feeling excluded, Victoria was always there to provide context and explanation. "Alexandra's at that difficult age," she'd tell him. "Teenage girls can be so dramatic. She just needs time to adjust to having brothers." My stepbrothers were given positions in my father's company despite having no interest in real estate and no relevant qualifications. Brandon was made director of special projects at age 20 with a 6-figure salary for doing essentially nothing. Trevor followed 2 years later with an equally inflated title and compensation. Meanwhile, my father's promises about me joining the family business as general counsel after law school were quietly forgotten. "The company needs to maintain professional boundaries," Victoria explained. "Nepotism isn't a good look for Morrison Commercial Real Estate." The irony of her sons being employed based purely on their relationship to my father while I was excluded for the same reason wasn't lost on me. But by this point, I was away at Georgetown Law School, seeing my father only during holidays when Victoria carefully orchestrated every interaction to minimize our private conversations. I graduated top of my class from Georgetown, passed the bar on my first attempt, and joined one of Atlanta's most prestigious law firms specializing in estate planning, trusts, and litigation. I built my career methodically, earning a reputation for brilliant strategic thinking and an almost obsessive attention to detail that made me invaluable to high-net-worth clients navigating complex family wealth structures. I dated occasionally but never seriously, building my professional identity while watching from a distance as my relationship with my father continued to deteriorate. Our conversations became surface-level exchanges at orchestrated family gatherings where Victoria controlled the narrative and my stepbrothers dominated the attention. Then came the diagnosis that changed everything. My father was 62 when doctors discovered the pancreatic cancer that would kill him within 18 months. The news devastated me, bringing back all the grief I'd felt at losing my mother and the additional anguish of knowing I'd lost my father long before his body would fail him. I tried to be present during his illness, offering to take time off work to help manage his care, to coordinate with doctors, to simply sit with him during his treatments. But Victoria had become the impenetrable wall between us. "He's resting," she'd say when I called. "He's not up for visitors," when I tried to visit. "He's asked not to be disturbed," when I showed up unannounced. I later learned that she'd been telling my father the opposite, that I was too busy with my career to visit, that I'd called but couldn't stay on the phone long, that I'd sent my regards but had important work obligations. She was simultaneously blocking my access while making it appear that I was the one choosing career over family. It was masterful manipulation, and it worked perfectly. During one of the few moments I managed to see my father alone, a stolen 15 minutes while Victoria was meeting with his doctors, he looked at me with confusion and what might have been disappointment. "You've become so independent, Alexandra," he said, his voice weakened by chemotherapy. "So focused on your career that you don't have time for family anymore." "Dad, that's not true," I started to protest. "I've been trying to see you." "But Victoria says." "Victoria has been here every day," he interrupted. "Taking care of me, managing everything, holding this family together. Her sons visit constantly, helping with the business, supporting me through this. I'm grateful to have them." The unspoken comparison hung between us. I had been replaced, not just in my father's affections but in his perception of reality itself. That's when I realized that crying, protesting, or trying to expose Victoria's manipulation would only reinforce the narrative she'd created. My father was dying, convinced by years of careful deception that I was the distant, career-obsessed daughter who'd chosen professional success over family loyalty. So I stopped fighting the narrative and started building my case. As an estate planning attorney, I understood how vulnerable wealthy, dying men were to manipulation by those controlling their care and access to information. I'd seen countless cases of elder abuse, undue influence, and fraudulent estate planning that disinherited legitimate heirs in favor of caregivers, new spouses, or manipulative relatives. I began investigating my stepmother with the same methodical approach I'd use for any client case. Except this time the stakes were deeply personal. The first breakthrough came through a private investigator I'd worked with on previous cases. Michael Chen was a former FBI agent who specialized in financial investigations and surveillance. I hired him to document Victoria's activities, financial transactions, and communications. What he discovered was more extensive than I'd imagined. Victoria had been systematically isolating my father from longtime friends, business associates, and family members who might question her influence. She'd convinced him to change his estate planning attorney from the man who'd handled his affairs for 30 years to a new lawyer who happened to be her divorce attorney's law partner. She'd implemented a medication management system that gave her complete control over my father's pain medications and treatments, allowing her to regulate his mental clarity and create windows of confusion during which important documents might be signed. Most damning, she'd been secretly recording conversations with my father and selectively editing them to create evidence of his wishes that aligned with her interests. These recordings were then provided to the new estate attorney as proof of my father's intentions. Michael also uncovered Victoria's financial history before meeting my father. She'd been married 3 times previously, each marriage ending in contentious divorce proceedings where she'd fought aggressively for maximum financial settlements. Her first husband had accused her of fraud. Her second had documented patterns of financial abuse and manipulation. Her third had settled quickly to avoid prolonged litigation, paying her substantially just to end the marriage. She was a professional predator who'd perfected the art of identifying, courting, and extracting wealth from successful men. But the most important discovery was about the will itself. Through careful research and a few professional courtesies from colleagues at the law firm Victoria had selected, I learned that my father's new estate plan had been drafted during a period of particularly aggressive pain medication, signed during a meeting where I was deliberately excluded, and witnessed by Victoria's personal assistant and her yoga instructor rather than the independent witnesses my father's previous attorney would have insisted upon. The will left everything to Victoria outright, with provisions for Brandon and Trevor that would give them control of the family business and substantial trust funds. I was mentioned in a single sentence that allocated me exactly $1 to confirm her intentional exclusion from my estate. That $1 bequest was legally significant, it proved. I hadn't been accidentally forgotten, but rather deliberately disinherited. It was meant to prevent me from challenging the will on grounds of being an overlooked heir. But Victoria had made several critical mistakes in her manipulation, and I was the perfect person to recognize them. As an estate planning attorney, I knew exactly what legal standards would be applied in a will contest. I understood the burden of proof for demonstrating undue influence, lack of testamentary capacity, and fraud. I'd successfully litigated dozens of similar cases, and I knew what evidence would be most compelling to a judge. More importantly, I knew what evidence I needed to gather before my father died to establish that this will did not reflect his true intentions or rational decision-making. I began documenting everything, every attempt Victoria made to prevent me from visiting my father, every inconsistency in her explanations, every interaction where my father seemed confused about our relationship or my supposed disinterest in his well-being. I obtained medical records showing the dosages and timing of pain medications that might affect cognitive function. I gathered testimony from nurses and healthcare workers who witnessed Victoria's controlling behavior. I collected evidence of her previous marriages and patterns of financial manipulation. And I waited. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March. With Victoria and her sons by his bedside, I received a text message 2 hours after he passed. Your father is gone. Funeral arrangements to follow. Victoria. Not a phone call. Not a conversation. Just a cold text message informing me that I'd lost my father without the chance to say goodbye. The funeral was held at Atlanta's largest cathedral, a spectacle of ostentation that my father would have hated but Victoria insisted represented his status in the community. Over 500 people attended, including business leaders, politicians, and society figures who'd known my father primarily through his wealth rather than his character. I sat in the front row, isolated on the end, while Victoria, Brandon, and Trevor occupied the center positions as if they were the only family that mattered. During the eulogy, Victoria spoke tearfully about the love of her life, the wonderful man who'd given her and her sons everything, the generous spirit who'd built a family empire that would continue through her careful stewardship. She never mentioned my mother. She barely acknowledged my existence. After the funeral, at the reception held at our family home that no longer felt like home, I overheard Victoria speaking with her attorney about finalizing everything quickly to avoid unnecessary complications. That's when I knew the reading of the will was imminent, and the performance Victoria had been preparing for years was about to reach its climax. The reading took place 1 week after the funeral in the conference room of Hartwell and Associates, the law firm Victoria had selected. The room was designed to impress, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Atlanta, expensive art on the walls, and furniture that whispered old money and established power. Victoria arrived dressed in designer mourning clothes, looking appropriately grief-stricken while her eyes betrayed satisfaction at what was about to unfold. Brandon and Trevor flanked her like bodyguards, both wearing matching expressions of smug entitlement. I arrived alone, carrying a leather portfolio that contained everything I would need for what came next. The attorney, Gerald Hartwell, was a silver-haired man in his 60s who'd built his practice on serving wealthy clients who valued discretion and flexibility over rigid ethical standards. He greeted Victoria warmly and me with cool professionalism, making the power dynamics immediately clear. "Thank you all for coming during this difficult time," Hartwell began, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "We're here today for the reading of James Morrison's last will and testament, executed 6 months ago under my supervision." He opened the leather portfolio in front of him and began reading the formal legal language that opened all such documents. Then he got to the substantive provisions. "To my beloved wife, Victoria Morrison, I leave my entire estate including all real property, business interests, investment accounts, and personal property, in recognition of her devotion, care, and love during our marriage." Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the perfect picture of a grieving widow receiving her late husband's final gift. "To my stepsons, Brandon and Trevor Blackwell, I leave controlling interest in Morrison Commercial Real Estate, to be held in trust managed by their mother until they reach the age of 35, along with trust funds of $5 million each." Brandon and Trevor exchanged satisfied looks, probably already mentally spending their inheritance. Then came the section about me. "To my daughter, Alexandra Catherine Morrison, I leave the sum of $1, to confirm that this minimal bequest is intentional and reflects my wishes regarding her inheritance." The words hung in the air like a slap. $1. My father's entire legacy, everything he'd built, everything he'd promised me during those Sunday dinners when it was just the two of us, reduced to $1 as proof that I'd been deliberately excluded. Hartwell looked up from the document, watching me with the carefully neutral expression of someone waiting for an emotional outburst that would confirm his client's narrative. Victoria turned to me with an expression of false sympathy that barely concealed her triumph. "I'm sure this is difficult to hear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But your father's wishes were very clear. He wanted his real family to be taken care of, and he felt you'd made your choices about what mattered to you." That's when she delivered the line, That made everything that followed feel justified. You were always just. A complication from his first marriage. A reminder of the past he was trying to move beyond. He found his true family with me and my sons. The attorneys in the room shifted uncomfortably. Even in the world of contentious estate litigation, such openly cruel statements were rare during formal proceedings. But instead of crying or screaming or reacting in any of the ways Victoria had anticipated, I simply smiled. I understand, I said calmly, gathering my portfolio. Thank you for making this so clear. Victoria's expression shifted to confusion. This wasn't the script she'd prepared for. She'd expected devastation, anger, threats of litigation, anything but calm acceptance. That's it? She asked, her voice betraying her confusion. You're not going to make a scene? Contest the will? Claim your father was manipulated? I stood up from my chair with practiced composure, smoothing my skirt and meeting her gaze directly. Why would I do any of those things? I asked. My father's wishes are clear, and I respect them completely. I turned to Hartwell. Thank you for your time, Mr. Hartwell. I assume you'll be filing this will with the probate court? He nodded, still looking somewhat suspicious of my composure. Within the week. Yes. Perfect, I said. I'll be watching for that filing with great interest. I walked out of that conference room knowing that Victoria had just made the fatal mistake of believing her victory was complete. She'd shown her hand, revealed her true nature in front of witnesses, and set in motion the probate process that would be her undoing. Because what Victoria didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had a different version of my father's will, the real one. The one he'd executed 3 months before the fraudulent document Victoria had just relied upon. The one that left me as the primary beneficiary of his estate with instructions that Victoria should receive only the minimal amount required by George's spousal protection laws. And I had the evidence to prove that the will Victoria had just celebrated was a fraud. I waited exactly 72 hours before filing my challenge to the will. Those 3 days were strategic, long enough to allow Victoria to begin celebrating her victory and implementing plans based on her assumed inheritance, but short enough that the probate process hadn't advanced beyond preliminary stages. My petition to the probate court was a masterpiece of legal precision, drafted with the same meticulous attention to detail I'd brought to every case in my career. But this time, the stakes were personal and the motivation was absolute. The filing included several key components. Count 1. Lack of testamentary capacity. I presented medical evidence showing that my father had been under heavy medication for pain management at the time of signing, including dosages that would significantly impair cognitive function and decision-making ability. Expert testimony from oncologists and neurologists established that patients at his stage of cancer treatment typically experience periods of confusion and diminished capacity. Count 2. Undue influence. I documented Victoria's systematic isolation of my father from family, friends, and trusted advisors. Evidence showed she controlled access to him, managed his medications, and created an environment where he was dependent on her for information and care. The pattern matched legal definitions of undue influence used in dozens of precedent cases. Count 3. Fraud. Most damning were the recordings Victoria herself had made. My investigation had uncovered not just the existence of these recordings, but evidence that they'd been selectively edited to misrepresent my father's statements. Digital forensic analysis revealed splice points, removed sections, and manipulated audio that had been used to falsely demonstrate his intentions. Count 4. Existence of prior valid will. I presented the will my father had executed 3 months earlier, witnessed by his longtime attorney, his accountant, and his physician, all independent parties with no interest in the estate. This will left the bulk of his estate to me, provided for Victoria according to legal requirements, and specifically stated his intention that his business and legacy should pass to his biological daughter. The evidence supporting this earlier will was overwhelming. My father had been lucid when signing it, had discussed his reasoning with multiple witnesses, and had expressed specific concerns about Victoria's influence over his finances and his desire to protect his legacy from her control. The effect of my filing was immediate and catastrophic for Victoria's plans. Within 24 hours, the probate court issued a temporary injunction freezing all of my father's assets pending resolution of the will contest. Victoria couldn't access bank accounts, couldn't sell properties, couldn't take control of the business. Everything was frozen. Her attorney, Gerald Hartwell, filed a motion to dismiss my challenge, but his arguments were weak and transparently designed to avoid scrutiny rather than address the substantive evidence I'd presented. The Atlanta legal community, always fascinated by high-stakes estate litigation, began following the case closely. Reporters from business publications requested comment. Society pages that had gushed about Victoria's marriage to my father now ran articles questioning her motives and highlighting the suspicious circumstances of the will. But the real destruction came from the business side. Morrison Commercial Real Estate had been built on my father's reputation for integrity, fair dealing, and long-term relationship management. When news broke that his estate was embroiled in litigation suggesting fraud and manipulation, major clients began questioning their relationships with the company. The company's board of directors, faced with frozen assets and reputational damage, voted to suspend Brandon and Trevor from their positions pending resolution of the legal proceedings. Without their inflated salaries and expense accounts, the two men who'd never actually worked a real day in their lives suddenly faced financial reality. Victoria's attorneys tried multiple strategies to make the case go away. They offered settlements that started generous and became increasingly desperate as evidence mounted against their position. They attacked my character, suggesting I was motivated by greed rather than justice. They even tried to claim that my profession as an estate attorney created a conflict of interest that should disqualify me from challenging the will. Nothing worked. Every motion they filed revealed more evidence of their fraud. Every argument they made highlighted the suspicious circumstances of the will's execution. Every attack on my character backfired as witnesses came forward to describe Victoria's manipulation and my father's true relationship with me. The breakthrough came during depositions. Victoria's personal assistant, the woman who'd served as one of the witnesses to the fraudulent will, broke down under questioning and admitted that she'd been pressured to sign documents without being allowed to read them fully, that she'd witnessed Victoria administering medications to my father right before important meetings, and that she'd been promised continued employment and bonuses for her cooperation. The yoga instructor who'd served as the other witness initially stood by his testimony, but digital forensic evidence revealed that he'd been paid $50,000 by Victoria 2 days after the will signing, a payment that was never reported to tax authorities and that he'd failed to disclose during initial questioning. Healthcare workers who'd cared for my father during his final months provided testimony about Victoria's controlling behavior, her insistence on managing his medication schedule herself, and concerning comments she'd made about ensuring proper outcomes for estate planning. Most devastating was the testimony from my father's longtime attorney, the man who'd been pushed aside by Victoria. He provided detailed accounts of my father's true intentions, his concerns about Victoria's influence, and his explicit instructions that his estate should primarily benefit me while providing for Victoria only as required by law. 6 months after filing my challenge, Victoria's attorneys requested a settlement conference. The judge, recognizing that the evidence overwhelmingly supported my position, strongly encouraged both sides to reach an agreement rather than proceed to trial. The conference took place in a neutral location, a mediator's office in Midtown Atlanta. Victoria arrived looking nothing like the confident woman who'd announced my disinheritance at the will reading. She'd aged visibly under the stress of litigation, her designer clothes hanging loosely on a frame that had lost weight from stress rather than intention. Brandon and Trevor sat on either side of their mother, their earlier smugness replaced by nervous anxiety. Without their trust funds and salaries from Morrison Commercial Real Estate, they'd burned through their savings and were facing the reality of their unemployability. My attorney, Patricia Williams, was one of Atlanta's most feared litigators, a woman whose reputation for demolishing opposing parties had made her my first choice when assembling my legal team. She laid out our position with brutal clarity. The evidence is overwhelming that the will dated 6 months before Mr. Morrison's death was procured through fraud, executed while he lacked testamentary capacity, and resulted from undue influence. Patricia began. We're prepared to proceed to trial where we're confident the court will void that document entirely and recognize the validity of the prior will executed 3 months earlier. She slid a document across the table. However, my client is willing to offer a settlement that avoids protracted litigation and allows Mrs. Morrison to retain some dignity despite her actions. The proposed settlement was devastating in its completeness. I would receive 85% of my father's estate, including controlling interest in Morrison Commercial Real Estate. Victoria would receive 15%. Barely more than George's spousal protection laws would have required regardless of any will. Brandon and Trevor would receive nothing. As they had no legal claim to my father's estate, Victoria would sign a comprehensive release, agreeing never to contest the settlement or make any further claims. All evidence of fraud would remain sealed, allowing Victoria to avoid criminal prosecution. Victoria would be required to vacate the family home within 90 days. This is absurd, Victoria's attorney sputtered. My client was married to James Morrison for 15 years. She's entitled to far more than. Your client is entitled to exactly what Georgia law provides to surviving spouses, Patricia interrupted, which is considerably less than what we're offering. The alternative is proceeding to trial, where we'll present evidence of systematic fraud, elder abuse, and financial manipulation that could result in criminal charges in addition to complete disinheritance. She leaned forward, her voice taking on an edge that made clear this was not a negotiation but a final offer. Mrs. Morrison can accept this settlement and walk away with approximately $30 million in her freedom. Or she can gamble on trial, where she'll likely receive the minimum required by law, approximately $15 million, while facing potential criminal prosecution, complete social ostracization, and years of continued litigation. The room fell silent. Victoria looked at her attorney, who gave the slightest shake of his head, a professional acknowledgement that they had no leverage and no realistic chance of achieving better terms. I need to discuss this with my sons, Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. You have 24 hours, Patricia replied. After that, we proceed to trial and this offer is permanently withdrawn. Victoria accepted the settlement. The next morning, the signing took place in the same conference room where she'd announced my disinheritance 6 Months earlier, a deliberate choice on my part to create symmetry in her humiliation. She arrived alone this time. Brandon and Trevor had apparently decided they couldn't face me after learning they'd receive nothing from my father's estate. Her attorney, Gerald Hartwell, looked like a man who'd aged a decade in 6 months. His reputation permanently damaged by association with such obvious fraud. I sat across from Victoria as she signed document after document, each one stripping away another piece of the empire she tried to steal. The pen scratched across page after page, the sound filling the otherwise silent room like an accusation. When all the signatures were complete, Victoria finally looked up at me. Her face was a mixture of hatred, defeat, and something that might have been grudging respect. "You planned this," she said quietly. "All of it. You knew what that will said before the reading. You already had your evidence prepared. You were just waiting for me to celebrate before destroying me." I met her gaze without emotion. "I'm an estate planning attorney, Victoria. I recognize fraud when I see it. And I document everything. Your father really did love me," she said. A last desperate attempt to salvage something from her defeat. "What we had was real. Whatever you might think. My father loved the woman you pretended to be," I corrected. The caring wife. The devoted caregiver. The woman who claimed to want nothing but his happiness. He never knew the predator underneath. The woman who'd been married 3 times before and extracted maximum wealth from each husband. The manipulator who isolated him from his daughter and systematically erased his first wife from his memory. Victoria flinched at the accuracy of my assessment. "But you know what the saddest part is?" I continued. "If you'd actually loved him, if you'd been genuine even partially, you would have ended up with far more than you're walking away with now. My father was generous to people he trusted. He would have provided well for you and your sons if you'd just been honest." I leaned forward, wanting her to understand the full scope of her miscalculation. "Instead, your greed and your need to completely erase me from his life led you to overreach. You couldn't be satisfied with being well provided for, you had to take everything. And that greed destroyed you." Victoria gathered her copies of the signed documents, stood, and walked toward the door. But she turned back before leaving, needing to have some final word. "You're just like your father," she said. "Cold, calculating, and willing to destroy anyone who gets in your way. Maybe that's why he preferred my family in the end. We actually knew how to love without keeping score." I smiled at this final attempt at manipulation. This last effort to make me doubt my actions or feel guilty about her consequences. "No, Victoria. I'm exactly like my mother. She taught me that grace and patience are not the same as weakness. And that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait for the right moment to act." My father forgot that lesson for a while, but his earlier will proved he remembered it in the end. After Victoria left, Patricia turned to me with an expression of professional satisfaction. "That was masterfully done," she said. 6 months ago she thought she'd won everything. Today she walked away with less than a fifth of the estate and her sons got nothing. "How does it feel?" I thought about the question carefully before answering. I'd spent 3 years preparing for this moment. 6 months fighting the legal battle. And countless hours documenting evidence and building the case that destroyed Victoria's scheme. "It feels like justice," I finally said. "Not revenge. Not victory, just justice. My father's legacy will be preserved according to his true wishes. The company he built will continue under proper management. And a woman who made a career of manipulating wealthy men finally faced consequences for her actions." "And the $1 bequest?" Patricia asked, referencing the deliberately insulting inheritance Victoria had arranged. I pulled out the check from my purse, exactly $1. made out to me from my father's estate. I'd framed it and planned to hang it in my office. This dollar represents everything Victoria thought she could take from me, my inheritance, my father's love, my place in his legacy. It's a reminder that what appears to be nothing can become everything when you know how to leverage it properly. 1 year after settling the estate litigation, I sit in my father's former office at Morrison Commercial Real Estate, now officially renamed Morrison & Morrison Commercial Real Estate, to honor both my father and my mother's contributions to our family legacy. The company has thrived under my leadership, with revenue increasing 35% as clients who'd left during the scandal returned after seeing the positive changes I implemented. Brandon and Trevor both attempted to sue me for their rightful inheritance, but those cases were dismissed with prejudice within weeks. They had no legal standing and their attorneys knew it. I hired back many of the longtime employees Victoria had pushed out during her reign, restoring institutional knowledge and the company culture my father had built. The executive team now includes several women in leadership positions, and we've implemented policies protecting against the kind of financial abuse and manipulation that Victoria had practiced. The family home in Buckhead, the one where Victoria had systematically erased my mother's presence, underwent complete renovation after she vacated. I brought back my mother's photos, restored her garden from old photographs and landscape plans, and created a library dedicated to her memory filled with her beloved books and personal items I'd saved from Victoria's purge. I live there now, in the home where I grew up, surrounded by memories of both my parents and the reminder that family legacies are built on more than just money. They're built on values, integrity, and the courage to fight for what's right even when the odds seem insurmountable. Victoria lives in a condominium in Midtown Atlanta, nice enough by normal standards, but a significant downgrade from the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to during her marriage. She attempted to launch a lifestyle blog about surviving family betrayal, but it gained little traction, mostly attracting comments from people who'd researched her background and weren't sympathetic to her victim narrative. Her sons both moved out of state, apparently unable to face the reality that their meal ticket had evaporated and they'd need to build actual careers rather than rely on unearned positions in a family business. Last I heard, Brandon was working in middle management at a regional bank, and Trevor was attempting to launch a cryptocurrency startup that seemed unlikely to succeed. I occasionally see items about Victoria in the society pages. She's attempted to reintegrate into Atlanta's social scene, but her reputation never recovered from the scandal. The circles that once welcomed her as James Morrison's wife now view her as the gold digger who tried to steal his daughter's inheritance. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome wasn't financial or social, it was personal. 6 months after the settlement, I received a letter from my father's longtime assistant, Margaret, who'd been forced into early retirement when Victoria took control. She'd been cleaning out storage units and discovered boxes of personal items my father had kept but Victoria had hidden away. Among those items was a journal my father had kept during his final months. The entries were sporadic, written during periods when his medication allowed clarity, and they revealed a man who understood far more than Victoria had realized. He wrote about missing me, about recognizing that he'd allowed Victoria to create distance between us, about regretting that he'd let his grief over my mother's death make him vulnerable to manipulation. He wrote about his concerns about Victoria's true motivations and his son's lack of genuine interest in the family business. Most importantly, he wrote about the will he'd executed 3 months before his death, the real one. The one that protected his legacy and ensured I would inherit what he'd built. He described the precautions he'd taken to keep this will secret from Victoria. The conversations with his trusted attorney about protecting me from her influence. And his hope that I would forgive him for the distance that had grown between us. The final entry, written just 2 weeks before his death, said simply, "Alexandra has her mother's strength and my stubbornness. She'll fight for what's right. And she'll win. I just wish I could be there to see it." I read that journal sitting in his office, tears streaming down my face for the first time since his funeral. Not tears of grief or anger, but of recognition that my father had never truly abandoned me. That beneath Victoria's manipulation he'd remained the man who'd held my hand at my mother's funeral and promised we'd face the world together. He'd just needed me to fight one final battle for both of us. The case became something of a legend in Atlanta's legal community. Law schools used it as a teaching example of undue influence and estate fraud. Elder law attorneys cited it in seminars about protecting vulnerable clients from financial predators. I was invited to speak at conferences about recognizing and documenting manipulation in estate planning situations. But the impact extended beyond professional circles. I began receiving letters and emails from other adult children who'd been disinherited by parents under suspicious circumstances, who'd watched stepparents systematically erase them from family legacies, who'd felt powerless against manipulation they couldn't prove or fight. These communications led me to establish the Catherine Morrison Foundation, named for my mother, dedicated to providing legal resources and support for families dealing with estate fraud and elder financial abuse. We offered pro bono legal consultations, funded investigations into suspicious estate planning, and advocated for stronger laws protecting elderly individuals from undue influence. The Foundation's first major case involved a situation eerily similar to mine, a daughter whose widowed father had remarried late in life, only to be systematically isolated and ultimately disinherited by a new wife with a documented history of targeting wealthy elderly men. Using strategies I'd developed during my own case, we successfully challenged the will and restored the daughter's rightful inheritance. Word spread. More cases followed. Each one was different in its specifics but followed recognizable patterns of isolation, manipulation, and fraudulent estate planning designed to disinherit legitimate heirs in favor of predatory caregivers or new spouses. We won most of them. The Foundation's work attracted media attention, and I found myself becoming an inadvertent advocate for elder protection and estate planning reform. I testified before state legislative committees about closing loopholes that allowed financial predators to exploit vulnerable elderly individuals. I worked with bar associations to develop better training for attorneys about recognizing and preventing undue influence. Victoria's case became the poster child for these efforts, a clear example of how wealthy, intelligent people could be manipulated by those who controlled their care and access to information during vulnerable periods of illness. 3 years after the settlement, I encountered Victoria at a charity gala I was attending as a corporate sponsor. The event benefited elder care advocacy, an irony that wasn't lost on either of us when we came face to face at the bar. She looked older than her years, the stress of her changed circumstances evident in ways that expensive clothing and skillful makeup couldn't quite hide. Her date was a man who appeared to be in his 70s. Wealthy judging by his watch and tailored suit. And Victoria was employing the same practiced charm I remembered from when she'd first targeted my father. "Alexandra," she said, her voice carrying forced pleasantness, "I didn't realize you'd be here tonight. I'm sponsoring the event through my foundation, I replied neutrally. We support organizations working to prevent elder financial abuse. A flash of anger crossed her face before she regained control. How noble of you. Build an entire charity empire on the back of destroying your stepmother's life. I built a charity dedicated to protecting vulnerable elderly people from predators, I corrected. If you see yourself in that description, perhaps that says more about you than me. Her date, sensing tension, excused himself to get drinks, leaving us alone in our uncomfortable standoff. Do you ever regret it? Victoria asked, dropping the pleasant facade. Everything you did, the way you destroyed my life and my son's futures? Do you ever feel guilty about the fact that you left us with barely anything while you took everything? I considered her question seriously, searching my conscience for regret or guilt and finding none. You left yourself with barely anything. Victoria, I simply prevented you from stealing what wasn't yours. You're still a multimillionaire living comfortably in one of America's most expensive cities. Your sons are adults who need to build their own careers rather than depend on money they never earned. I haven't destroyed anyone's life, I've just removed the option of living parasitically off my father's legacy. I loved him, she insisted. And for a moment, I almost believed there was genuine emotion beneath the manipulation. Maybe you did, I acknowledged. Maybe there was real feeling mixed in with the calculation and greed. But love doesn't justify fraud. It doesn't excuse systematically isolating someone from their family. It doesn't make it acceptable to manipulate a dying man into disinheriting his only biological child. I picked up my wine glass, preparing to walk away from this conversation and this chapter of my life. You want to know if I have regrets, Victoria? I regret that my father's final years were spent under your manipulation instead of surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him. I regret that he died believing I'd chosen my career over our relationship because you systematically blocked my access to him. I regret that his legacy was nearly destroyed by someone who saw him as nothing more than a source of wealth to be extracted. I met her eyes directly, wanting her to understand completely. But I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret using every skill I had to expose your fraud and protect what my parents built. And I especially don't regret ensuring that their legacy will continue to benefit people genuinely in need rather than funding the lifestyle of someone who made a career of exploiting wealthy, lonely men. Victoria's face hardened into an expression of pure hatred. You're so self-righteous, so convinced you're some kind of hero. But you're just a bitter daughter who couldn't accept that your father moved on from your mother and built a new family. If that's what you need to tell yourself to sleep at night, go ahead, I replied. But we both know the truth. And more importantly, so does every court, every attorney, and every person who reviewed the evidence of your systematic fraud. I started to walk away, then turned back for one final comment. By the way, you might want to be more careful about your companion this evening. I recognize him, Lawrence Henderson, widower, recently diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. Estimated net worth of $80 million. He's hired our foundation to review his estate planning and ensure he's protected from potential undue influence. The color drained from Victoria's face as she realized I'd identified her next target and preemptively moved to protect him. Some people never learn, I said softly. But some of us make it our mission to ensure they can't keep hurting others. On the 5th anniversary of my father's death, I visited his grave at Atlanta's Oakland Cemetery. The plot was next to my mother's, where he'd always intended to be buried. Before Victoria had tried to change those plans too, I'd brought my father's journal, the one Margaret had found. and I read through it again surrounded by the peaceful quiet of the old cemetery. His words felt like a final conversation, a chance to understand his perspective on everything that had happened. After finishing the journal, I pulled out a letter I'd written the night before, words I needed to say even though he'd never read them. I folded the letter and placed it under a stone on his grave, knowing the words would eventually be destroyed by weather but needing to physically leave them there nonetheless. Today, I run Morrison & Morrison Commercial Real Estate with annual revenues exceeding $300 million. The Catherine Morrison Foundation has helped over 200 families protect their elderly relatives from financial exploitation. I've been recognized by business publications, legal organizations, and advocacy groups for my work in estate planning and elder protection. But the achievements I'm most proud of aren't measured in revenue or awards. I'm proud that my parents' legacy survived an attempt to erase it completely. I'm proud that their values of integrity, hard work, and genuine relationships continue to guide a company that employs over 300 people. I'm proud that their story has helped protect others from the kind of manipulation and exploitation Victoria practiced. Most importantly, I'm proud that I didn't let grief, anger, or desire for revenge cloud my judgment or compromise my principles. I fought back using legal tools, documented evidence, and strategic patience rather than emotional outbursts or public drama. Victoria wanted me to be the hysterical, bitter daughter who couldn't accept her father's new family. Instead, I was the methodical, strategic attorney who dismantled her fraud piece by piece using the very systems she tried to manipulate. She wanted my father to remember me as the distant, career-obsessed child who'd abandoned him. Instead, his journal revealed he understood the truth and had protected me even while unable to fight back openly. She wanted to erase my mother's memory and replace it with her own sanitized version of family history. Instead, the Catherine Morrison Foundation ensures my mother's values of grace, strength, and protection of the vulnerable continue to impact lives decades after her death. If you're listening to this story because you've experienced something similar, a parent manipulated in their final years, a family legacy stolen by someone who married into wealth rather than earning it, the pain of being systematically erased from your own family history, I want you to know something important. You are not powerless. Documentation is your weapon. Every inappropriate interaction, every suspicious circumstance, every attempt to isolate your parent from family and trusted advisors, document it all with dates, times, witnesses, and evidence. Professional expertise is your shield. Hire attorneys who specialize in estate litigation and elder abuse. Consult with forensic accountants who can trace financial manipulation. Work with investigators who can uncover patterns of predatory behavior. Patience is your strategy. Don't react emotionally to provocations designed to make you look unstable or vindictive. Wait for the right moment. Gather overwhelming evidence. And then act with precision rather than passion. And most importantly, remember that justice delayed is not justice denied if you're using that delay to build an unbeatable case. Victoria thought she'd won everything when my father died, leaving her that fraudulent will. She celebrated her victory publicly, isolated me socially, and prepared to spend my father's fortune as if she'd earned it through years of genuine partnership rather than months of calculated manipulation. She had no idea that every day she celebrated was another day I was gathering evidence, building my case, and preparing for the systematic destruction of her fraud. 3 years of investigation, 6 months of litigation, one comprehensive settlement that left her with a fraction of what she'd tried to steal and ensured my parents' legacy would survive her attempt to erase it. The girl from Buckhead who'd lost both her parents and nearly lost their entire legacy now sits in a corner office running a company worth hundreds of millions, leading a foundation that protects vulnerable families, and using her platform to ensure that predators like Victoria face consequences for their actions. Some people will say I was vindictive, that I should have let Victoria have her victory and moved on with my life. Those people have never watched someone systematically destroy their parents' memory while stealing everything they built. Others will say I was just protecting what was legally mine, that I simply used my professional skills to challenge fraudulent estate planning. Those people understand that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with emotion but with evidence, not with drama but with documentation, not with revenge but with relentless pursuit of justice. I've learned that the most dangerous person in any room isn't the one who makes the loudest threats or the most dramatic gestures. It's the one who sits quietly, taking notes, gathering evidence, and waiting for exactly the right moment to act. Victoria Blackwell learned that lesson too late to save the fortune she tried to steal. But perhaps other predators, reading this story or hearing about my case, will learn it early enough to reconsider their plans to exploit vulnerable elderly people for financial gain. Because there are more of us than they realize, adult children who love our parents, professionals who understand the law, and people who refuse to let manipulation and fraud go unchallenged just because it's wrapped in marriage vows and practiced with a smile. We're watching, we're documenting, and we're ready to fight. If this story resonated with you, if you've faced similar battles or know someone who's fighting to protect their family legacy from predatory manipulation, remember that you're not alone and victory is possible even when the odds seem impossible. Hit that subscribe button to join over 600,000 readers who believe that justice served with precision and patience can change not just individual lives but entire systems that allow exploitation to flourish unchallenged. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's been told they're being paranoid or vindictive for questioning suspicious circumstances. Someone who needs to know that challenging fraud isn't about being difficult, it's about honoring the people we love and protecting the legacies they built. Leave a comment below sharing your own experiences with estate fraud or elder manipulation. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to fight back. And remember, every empire built on lies and manipulation contains the seeds of its own destruction. Sometimes those seeds just need a patient gardener who knows exactly when to water them. Lunghezza finale. Circa 68.000 caratteri. 50 to 60 minuti di contenuto.